The morning air over Iwo Jima hung thick with volcanic dust and fear. U.S. Marines had learned the hard way that nothing came easy on this 8-square-mile patch of hell. The Japanese weren't just defending. They were buried deep in the earth itself, waiting. Every ridge hid a cave, every cave a nest of machine guns, and every inch of black sand cost blood to take. Then came a new kind of weapon. Not faster bullets, not bigger bombs. Fire. When the first M2 flamethrower hissed to life on Iwo Jima, it wasn't just the Japanese who were stunned, it was everyone. The weapon roared like a dragon, belching a stream of liquid fire that reached out 30 meters, wrapping bunkers in searing orange. The air cracked with heat. Stone blackened. Metal screamed. Inside, men burned alive or suffocated in an instant. The Marines called it the one thing they feared using, but loved having. The Japanese called it something else, the fire that walks. Most Japanese soldiers had been trained to fight to the death. They believed dying with honor was sacred. But nothing in their code prepared them for a weapon that could erase them from existence. In letters recovered after the battles, some survivors described seeing comrades disappear into light, their screams swallowed by the roar. The flamethrower was more than a weapon. It was psychological warfare. U.S. units soon realized that one burst of fire could achieve what hours of shelling could not. Break the will of defenders who refused to surrender. Caves that had withstood days of bombardment were cleared in seconds. Whole networks of tunnels became ovens. But the weapon was as dangerous to its user as to its target. The M2 flamethrower weighed nearly 70 pounds when full, and the man carrying it instantly became a priority target. Japanese snipers learned to spot the silhouette of the tanks on a Marine's back. A single bullet to the fuel line could turn the operator into a fireball. Yet still, volunteers lined up to carry it. Not out of bravery alone, but out of vengeance. Every Marine knew how many friends had been lost trying to take just one cave. By the second week of the invasion, the Marines had perfected the grim routine. Tanks would hammer a hillside, riflemen would pin down exits, and the flamethrower teams would move in. You could hear the fuel ignite inside the caves, one Marine recalled, and then the screaming stopped. Some soldiers turned away. Others watched silently, knowing that for every flame used, dozens of American lives were spared. It was brutal math, but on Iwo Jima, mercy didn't exist. As night fell, the horizon still glowed orange from burning fortifications. From the caves, black smoke rose into the dark sky, each plume marking a place where fire had devoured flesh and stone alike. The fire had arrived on Iwo Jima, and soon it would move south to Okinawa. They called it Typhoon of Steel. But for the men who landed on Okinawa in April 1945, it was something worse, a storm of fire and flesh. The battle was supposed to be quick. After all, the island was small, only 60 miles long. The Americans thought it would take 2 weeks to secure. Instead, it lasted nearly 3 months, becoming the bloodiest battle of the Pacific War. And at the heart of that horror stood one weapon, the flamethrower. When the 6th Marine Division pushed south through Okinawa's ridges, they met something they hadn't expected, a fortress beneath their feet. The Japanese had dug in so deep that their defenses seemed to grow from the earth itself. Entire regiments vanished underground into an endless web of tunnels, pillboxes, and caves, forming what U.S. intelligence called the Shuri Line. Artillery barely scratched it. Bombers could turn hills into rubble. But the enemy simply reappeared, crawling from vents like ghosts. Rifles and grenades were useless against concrete bunkers buried into volcanic rock. That's when the Marines turned again to the most feared weapon they carried, the M2 flamethrower, and its monstrous cousin, the PWS H-1 flame tank, a modified Sherman arm with a flamethrower cannon instead of its 75mm gun. The Japanese called these tanks Keinsensha, fire tanks. The Marines called them Satan. When Satan rolled up to a cave entrance, everyone knew what came next. The tank's nozzle swung toward the black opening, and then whoosh, a stream of napalm erupted, thick and sticky, clinging to everything it touched. The flames weren't bright yellow like in the movies. They were deep orange and red, heavy, almost liquid. The napalm rolled into the tunnels like molten lava, finding air pockets and exploding in bursts that blew out the caves from within. Sometimes, the pressure of the fire ignited trapped ammunition or grenades, sending geysers of sparks into the sky. Other times, the fire consumed all the oxygen, suffocating men before the heat even reached them. "You could hear them," one Marine said. "You could hear the screams for a second, and then silence." The psychological effect was immediate. U.S. intelligence noted that more Japanese soldiers surrendered during flamethrower attacks than under any other form of assault. To be burned alive was seen as the ultimate dishonor, a death so horrific that even the indoctrinated defenders of the emperor hesitated. But many refused to yield, choosing to charge the tanks in suicidal rushes, clutching grenades or satchel charges. One report from the 1st Marine Division described a scene near the Kakazu Ridge. A Japanese soldier, his clothes and hair aflame, ran screaming from the cave and leapt at the tank. He exploded before he reached it, but the fire from his body smeared across the hull. The Marines barely reacted. They couldn't afford to. By then, compassion had burned away as surely as the hillside in front of them. The constant mixture of rain and fire turned Okinawa into a nightmare landscape. Flames from the tanks rolled down slopes into flooded trenches, where fuel floated on the surface and ignited, sending rivers of fire across the mud. The stench of burned flesh mixed with the smell of wet earth, creating a scent that haunted the survivors for decades. For the Japanese, the caves that had once been sanctuaries became tombs. For the Americans, the flamethrower was a grim necessity, a way to end the battle faster, to save men from crawling inch by inch into dark holes full of death. By May, Okinawa's hills glowed at night with the light of burning tunnels. The Marines joked that they didn't need stars anymore. The island itself was on fire. But beneath that bitter humor, something darker grew. The men who used the flamethrowers began to wonder what the fire was doing to them. Because once you've unleashed hell, how do you come back from it? They were called torchmen. And even among the battle-hardened veterans of the Pacific, nobody envied them. Carrying an M2 flamethrower wasn't a job. It was a death sentence waiting to be written. 70 pounds of fuel and nitrogen tanks strapped to your back, enough gasoline to burn a small house, and a single hit away from turning into a walking fireball. Yet every platoon had a few men who volunteered. Not because they were fearless, but because fear didn't matter anymore. Private First Class Russell Red Daniels of the 5th Marines was one of them. His first day on Iwo Jima, he saw a buddy vaporized by a landmine. 2 days later, another was shot through the neck trying to clear a cave with grenades. When they asked for volunteers to handle the flamethrower, Daniels recalled years later, "I figured, hell, if I'm going to die anyway, I'll take a few of them with me." Red trained for only 3 days before being sent into combat. The manual said the M2 could fire a burst for about 7 seconds. In practice, it was shorter, 3 or 4 seconds of hell. The trick was timing. A quick blast, then duck because the heat wave could roast your own skin. Operators wore only thin canvas uniforms. No armor, no flame-resistant suits. Just a helmet, gloves, and luck. The first time Daniels used the weapon, it wasn't clean. The cave was too deep, the angle too steep. He fired anyway. The flame hit the rock and splashed back, catching the ground around him. He dropped and rolled in the sand, patting out the fire while bullets snapped overhead. "That's when I learned," he said, "fire doesn't care who you are. It eats everything." The Marines learned quickly to work in pairs. One man carried the flamethrower, another the rifle. The second man's job was to protect the torchman from snipers, and to finish the job if something went wrong. Many formed bonds stronger than brothers. Some even made dark pacts. "If I go up in flames, don't let me live." On Okinawa, a flamethrower operator's life expectancy during an assault was measured in minutes. Yet they kept going step by step, hill by hill, cave by cave. They became legends among their units, feared, respected, and pitted. Sergeant Charles Mac McCool of the 6th Division became famous for clearing 17 caves in a single day near Sugarloaf Hill. His men said he moved like he had no soul left. Mac would walk right up to a hole, light it up, and turn away before the scream started, one Marine wrote. He never looked back. But at night, when the firing stopped, it was different. Many of these men couldn't sleep. They saw flames behind their eyes, smelled burned flesh in every meal. Some confessed to chaplains that they'd begun to enjoy the power, the feeling of control that came with the fire. Others begged to be reassigned, claiming their hands shook too much to aim anymore. The military called it combat fatigue. The flamethrower men called it the burn inside. After the war, few of them spoke. The ones who did often described the same nightmare, hearing the whoosh of ignition, the roar of the flame, and the sudden silence after. That silence, Daniel said, was worse than the screaming, because you knew it meant they weren't people anymore, just smoke. To the Japanese, the flamethrower was terror. To the Americans, it was survival. But to the men who used it, it was something else entirely, a curse that followed them home. They were the keepers of the inferno, and the fire never really went out. By May 1945, the southern half of Okinawa looked like the surface of another planet. Hills that once held farms and villages were now shredded by artillery. Craters filled with rainwater reflected the smoke-darkened sky. And beneath that broken land lay an empire of tunnels, the Shuri Line, Japan's final bastion on the Ryukyu Islands. The Shuri Line wasn't just a defensive network. It was an underground city. Built into coral ridges and volcanic rock, it stretched for miles. Some tunnels were wide enough for trucks. Others were narrow crawl spaces linking hundreds of firing positions. Hidden bunkers contained ammunition stores, hospitals, and command posts. The Japanese 32nd Army, commanded by General Mitsu Ushijima, had turned Okinawa into a subterranean fortress, one meant to make the Americans pay for every inch of ground. On the surface, the Marines saw only silence. Hills like Sugarloaf, Kakazu Ridge, and Shuri Castle seemed abandoned. Then a helmet would glint, a shot would ring out, and hell would open beneath their feet. Entire platoons vanished in a fire from invisible guns. When the Americans bombed the hills, the explosions barely scratched the surface. The enemy simply vanished deeper into the rock. At first, the U.S. forces tried traditional tactics: artillery, mortars, grenades. Nothing worked. The Japanese had mastered defense in depth. Even when a cave entrance was sealed, another opening appeared a few yards away. Soldiers joked bitterly that Okinawa wasn't a battle. It was an exorcism. That's when the flamethrowers came. The Marines began calling their new approach cave burning. It was as methodical as it was brutal. Recon units marked suspected entrances with white phosphorus grenades. Engineers followed, laying satchel charges. Then came the flame teams and tanks. They didn't just fire into one hole. They moved in pairs, covering every possible exit. A tank would unleash a river of napalm into a dark slit in the hillside. The fire would roar inward, feeding on the oxygen, crawling through tunnels, wrapping itself around corners. Seconds later, other openings on the slope would erupt like volcanoes as the flames found their way out. The ground itself seemed to breathe fire. Japanese soldiers who survived the initial blast often died, gasping for air. The fire consumed everything: oxygen, gunpowder, and flesh. One Marine remembered standing over a smoking vent, watching black smoke twist upward like a soul leaving the earth. In some areas, the fire burned for days. When engineers later entered the caves, they found walls covered in soot, melted rifles, and bones fused with coral. The heat had been so intense that it had turned sections of rock into glass. Shuri Castle, once the royal palace of the Ryukyu Kingdom, became the symbol of this underground war. Beneath its elegant gates lay command tunnels where General Ushijima and his staff directed operations. The U.S. Navy shelled it for days. 200 naval guns pounded the hill while aircraft dropped tons of bombs. Still, the defenders held. Only when the Marines brought in flame tanks and demolitions did the resistance begin to break. When the Americans finally entered the ruins of Shuri Castle, the smell hit them first: burned oil, cordite, and something worse. They found charred remains in corridors that had become chimneys. One sergeant wrote home, "We didn't conquer that hill. We burned it out." What had begun as a tactical necessity became a symbol of the Pacific War's descent into total destruction. There were no front lines anymore, just layers of earth and death. The Japanese fought from the underworld. The Americans answered with fire from above. By mid-May, the Shuri line was collapsing. The caves that once shielded the defenders had become their tombs. But for every cave taken, there were 10 more ahead. The fire was winning, but at a cost. Because every time a Marine lit his flamethrower, he knew he was burning away not just the enemy's will, but a piece of his own humanity. The first time Marines saw napalm in action, they didn't believe what they were looking at. It wasn't fire as they knew it. It didn't flash or fade. It crawled. It stuck. It ate. Napalm was born in a Harvard laboratory in 1942. The scientist who created it, led by chemist Louis Fieser, had intended it as a more efficient incendiary for bombs and flamethrowers. They mixed gasoline with a thickening agent derived from aluminum salts of naphthenic and palmitic acids, thus the name napalm. The result was a gel that burned longer, hotter, and more viciously than anything before it. In theory, it was just chemistry. In practice, it was hell in liquid form. By the time U.S. forces reached Okinawa, napalm had already been tested in the jungles of the Philippines and the islands of the Marianas. But Okinawa was where it became infamous. The new flame tanks, M4A3 Shermans modified into PWS H1 models, were fitted with Mark I or Ronson flame units that fired thick jets of napalm up to 150 yards. Each tank carried 400 gallons of the stuff. When they fired, it didn't explode, it flowed, a burning tide that rolled down hillsides and poured into caves. The flames clung to rock, mud, and flesh alike. Water didn't stop it. Rain didn't matter. Marines watched in awe as napalm burned even underwater puddles, its orange glow reflecting off the surface like molten metal. It burned where nothing else would. One corporal said, "You could throw a bucket of water at it, and it would just dance." Japanese soldiers trapped inside the Shuri line had no defense. The thick gel poured into their tunnels, finding air pockets, suffocating and incinerating at once. Survivors described feeling the fire move around them before it touched, an invisible wave of heat that sucked the oxygen from their lungs. One Japanese officer wrote in his diary, "The air turned to flame. My comrades vanished in the light." To the Americans, napalm was a godsend. It could do in seconds what hours of bombardment couldn't: flush out the caves, burn supplies, break morale. But even among Marines hardened by years of war, there was something unsettling about the weapon. Watching it wasn't like watching an explosion. It was watching a process. It was slow, methodical, deliberate. A Marine flamethrower operator named Joe Hagan recalled one assault on Okinawa's Wana Ridge. You'd see a man run out of a cave, and the napalm was on him. He didn't die right away. He'd keep moving, burning, and you couldn't help him. There was no way. Napalm didn't just kill. It marked the battlefield. After a day of flame operations, the hills of Okinawa looked like a painting of the apocalypse. The once green slopes were black and glassy. Pools of congealed gel hardened into twisted amber shapes. The smell, burned gasoline mixed with flesh and soil, clung to the men's uniforms, their weapons, even their food. By 1945, U.S. strategists realized they had found the ultimate psychological weapon. Napalm broke not only bodies but belief. For Japanese troops raised on the Bushido Code, to die without honor, without even a body to bury, was unbearable. Some units began to commit mass suicides rather than face the flames. Meanwhile, American commanders saw in napalm the future of warfare. If it could burn a cave, it could burn a city. That logic soon leapt from Okinawa's ridges to Japan's mainland, where B-29 bombers carried thousands of M-69 napalm bomblets. On March 9, 1945, Tokyo itself became a sea of fire. In a single night, 100,000 people died as napalm turned neighborhoods into infernos hotter than molten steel. What had begun as a tactical weapon on the battlefield now rewrote the rules of war. The Pacific was burning, and there was no going back. By the time Okinawa fell in June, the Americans had perfected the art of fire. Napalm, once a laboratory curiosity, had become their cruelest instrument, and the Japanese, from the caves of Shuri to the streets of Tokyo, had felt its touch. But the war wasn't over yet. The fire would soon find its way to Hiroshima and Nagasaki, though in a form even more terrible. War had turned Okinawa into a furnace, and not everyone caught in the flames wore a uniform. Beneath the thunder of artillery and the roar of flamethrowers, there were cries of the island's own people, the Okinawans, trapped between two armies. Before the invasion, Okinawa's population stood at around 400,000. By the battle's end, nearly one-third of them were dead. To the Americans, it was another battlefield. To the Okinawans, it was home. Their villages became front lines. Their caves became shelters and graves. When the Japanese 32nd Army fortified the southern half of the island, they forced civilians to dig trenches, carry ammunition, and move supplies. Families were told to hide in the same caves that now served as military bunkers. Some were given grenades for self-defense. Others were told that if captured by Americans, they would be tortured, mutilated, or worse. Propaganda spread through leaflets and loudspeakers. The Americans are demons. Better to die as Japanese than live as slaves. And then came the fire. When U.S. flame tanks and M2 teams began their systematic clearing of caves, they didn't know, or couldn't tell, who was inside. Every dark hole looked the same through the gun sight. Napalm didn't discriminate between soldier and civilian. When the fire rolled into those tunnels, it consumed everyone. Marines reported hearing voices, women, children, screaming as the fire reached deep into the caves. Some units tried to shout warnings, but the language barrier and chaos made it impossible. We'd yell for them to come out, one Marine remembered, but nobody moved. Then the order came, and we burned it. Afterward, when the smoke cleared, they found the truth. In one hillside cave near Mabuni, the 1st Marine Division discovered more than 150 civilians, most of them women and children, burned together in a single chamber. Some were clutching one another, their bodies fused by heat. The cave was still warm when the Marines entered. These scenes repeated across the island. On cliffs overlooking the sea, entire families threw themselves into the waves rather than face capture. Others used grenades distributed by retreating soldiers. In some places, mothers strangled their children to spare them the flames. The air itself seemed alive with smoke, screams, and ash. Okinawan survivor Keiko Higa was 13 when the battle reached her village. In an interview decades later, she said, "We could hear the Americans shouting, but we were told they would kill us. The soldiers told us, when the fire comes, don't let them take you. I saw people jumping from the cliffs. The sky was red from the flames. To the Americans, the civilian suicides were incomprehensible. To the Japanese command, they were tragic proof that the propaganda had worked. General Ushijima's staff had convinced an entire population that death by fire was preferable to surrender. The result was genocide by fear. The use of flamethrowers intensified the horror. The fire didn't just destroy bodies, it destroyed faith. Buddhist priests described the flames as hungry ghosts devouring the island's spirit. Survivors later said that even decades after the war, the smell of burning oil or the sight of fireworks could make them collapse in panic. When the U.S. forces finally declared Okinawa secured on June 22, 1945, the island was unrecognizable. Hills were stripped bare, villages erased. The smell of burned flesh lingered for weeks. One Marine chaplain wrote, "We have won the ground, but I'm not sure we have any right to it." For the civilians who lived through it, victory was meaningless. They had lost their homes, their families, and their sense of humanity. The Americans left graves and relief stations. The Japanese left ghosts and silence. In the end, Okinawa became more than just the last battle before the invasion of Japan. It became a warning. The fire that consumed the island showed the world what total war truly meant. When the line between soldier and civilian, life and death, mercy and vengeance, all turned to smoke. And as the last flames flickered out over the blackened hills, both sides knew one terrible truth. The fire would not stop here. To the Japanese soldier of 1945, death was not defeat. It was duty. From the first day of training, he was taught that surrender was shameful, that true loyalty to the emperor meant dying for him. The code of Bushido, the ancient warrior's way, still shaped every order and every thought. But when the flames came, when the fire rolled through the tunnels and the air itself caught fire, that sacred code began to crack. On Okinawa, the caves were not just fortresses, they were sanctuaries of honor. Officers decorated their underground positions with calligraphy scrolls, hanging inked poems about courage and sacrifice on the stone walls. Soldiers meditated before battle. They believed that if they fought bravely and died facing the enemy, their spirits would ascend pure and untainted. Then came a sound, a low hiss, a metallic click, and the cave filled with light. The flamethrower didn't just destroy bodies, it destroyed meaning. There was no way to die with honor when death came as an invisible flood of heat and smoke, when your comrades turned to ash before your eyes. It was annihilation without witness, a death with no ritual, no glory. Reports from captured Japanese soldiers and recovered diaries tell a consistent story. Terror. One survivor wrote, "It is not war, it is punishment from the gods." Another said, "To burn is to vanish. No soul remains." The Bushido ideal demanded composure in death, a calm acceptance of fate. But under napalm, there was only chaos, screaming, thrashing, and panic. Officers tried to restore order, shouting commands into the smoke. Some forced their men to charge out of the caves, running straight into machine gun fire. Others drew their swords and committed seppuku, slicing open their stomachs as the flames advanced, determined to die by their own hands rather than by the Americans. In one cave complex near Mabuni, U.S. Marines found a group of officers who had lined up in formation before a small shrine. Each had committed seppuku, their swords still in their hands. The walls behind them were scorched black. The fire had reached them seconds later. General Mitsu Ushijima himself embodied this fatal honor. When the Shuri line finally fell in June 1945, he and his chief of staff, General Isamu Cho, refused to surrender. As the Americans closed in, Ushijima ordered his staff to burn documents and destroy all remaining weapons. Then, on the night of June 21st, beneath the cliffs of Mabuni, he performed seppuku by lantern light. His last message: "We have fought valiantly and have no regrets. May the Emperor live 10,000 years." When the Marines found his body the next morning, the ground around him was still warm from the fire that had swept through the area hours earlier. But for many rank-and-file soldiers, there was no ceremony, only fire. Their Bushido training told them to die bravely, but their senses told them to run. Some threw themselves onto grenades to escape the flames. Others tried to crawl out of burning caves, only to be cut down by machine gun fire. The Americans, hardened by weeks of slaughter, often saw these acts as fanaticism, not desperation. They could understand that for the Japanese, surrender wasn't simply forbidden, it was unthinkable. The fire had erased the possibility of a good death, leaving only terror and disgrace. In that way, the flamethrower didn't just defeat the Japanese army, it broke its soul. In later years, Japanese veterans would speak of the fire in hushed tones. They didn't call it napalm or flame. They called it Hano no Kami, the god of fire. To them, it wasn't just a weapon. It was a divine punishment, a force that stripped away every illusion of nobility and exposed the raw, unbearable truth of modern war. When the flames of Okinawa died out, Bushido died with them. The ideal of the unbreakable warrior, the purity of death for the emperor, all turned to smoke over the Black Hills. And in that smoke, Japan began to see the future, not one of honor, but of ashes. While Marines burned the caves of Okinawa, another group followed close behind, not with rifles, but with cameras and notebooks. They were the war correspondents, the chroniclers of hell. Men like Joe Rosenthal, Eugene Smith, and Robert Sherrod had seen battle before, but nothing prepared them for the sight of men wielding fire as a weapon. Their mission was simple in theory: document the Pacific Campaign, capture heroism, show progress. But on Okinawa, progress looked like death on an industrial scale. The journalists were supposed to inspire hope back home. Instead, many found themselves haunted by what they saw. Photographer Eugene Smith, working for Life magazine, moved with the Marines through the mud and smoke of the island. He was hit by shrapnel twice, but kept shooting, his camera clicking in rhythm with machine gun bursts. His photos showed Marines crouched in rain-soaked trenches, faces streaked with soot, staring at hills that glowed orange from flamethrower bursts. In one now famous shot, the silhouette of a flame tank illuminates the night sky, a river of fire spilling from its cannon. When those images reached editors in the United States, many hesitated to publish them. They were too graphic, too raw. The flames didn't look like victory, they looked like judgment. One censor described Smith's negatives as beyond morale value. Still, Life ran them, because they couldn't look away from what the war had become. Reporter Robert Sherrod, embedded with the Marines for time, described a scene near the Shuri line that would later define his career. In his notes, he wrote, "We watched a man pour fire into the earth. There were screams, and then nothing. The ground smoked for hours. The odor was indescribable, gasoline and cooked meat. I remember thinking, this isn't war, it's cremation." For correspondents like Sherrod, the challenge wasn't just physical survival, it was emotional endurance. They had to record the unbearable and make sense of it for readers who could never imagine such horror. In his Okinawa dispatches, Sherrod's language changed. Less about strategy, more about survival. Each hill, he wrote, is a new wound. Cameramen from a U.S. Army Signal Corps captured moving images that would later appear in newsreels. Their footage showed bursts of flame arcing across black hillsides, men advancing through smoke, the eerie quiet after the fire stopped. But the military tightly controlled what the public saw. Most of the footage showing the true effects, the charred bodies, the screaming survivors, was locked away, labeled for restricted viewing only. Some correspondents broke under the strain. Tom Leah, the artist who painted for Life, spent weeks sketching battlefield scenes. After Okinawa, he confessed he could no longer draw flames. "The color red," he said, "was ruined for me." Those who survived carried the war home in their lenses and notebooks. Eugene Smith returned to the U.S. and spent years photographing hospitals and wounded veterans. He said Okinawa changed how he saw humanity. "I used to think I could photograph courage. Now, I know courage has no face. It's just what's left when fear runs out." The stories and photographs that did reach the public created shockwaves. Americans had grown used to tales of heroism. The flag raising on Iwo Jima, the island victories, but the fire war of Okinawa felt different. It wasn't glorious. It was grotesque. Letters poured into newspapers questioning whether such weapons should exist. But the official line was clear. The flamethrowers saved lives by ending the fight faster. Few dared to argue. Still, the journalists had planted seeds of doubt. In their stark black and white images, Americans glimpsed the moral cost of victory. Behind every liberated hill lay the dark truth that modern warfare had become not about defeating armies, but about consuming them. Years later, when the world saw napalm again, in Korea, in Vietnam, it was the ghosts of Okinawa that flickered in every flame. The men who'd watched hell through their lenses had already warned us, and we hadn't listened. When the guns finally fell silent on Okinawa in late June 1945, the island didn't celebrate. It smoldered. Smoke still rose from the hills weeks after the fighting ended. The ground was black and glassy, scarred by flame and steel. Marines walking across the battlefield said the earth crunched under their boots, not from gravel, but from burned bone fragments mixed with ash. They called it the island that would not cool. The fire had changed everything, not just the landscape, but the men themselves. U.S. soldiers who survived the battle spoke later of feeling hollow, detached. "I left something in those caves," one Marine said, "and I don't think I ever got it back." The war had demanded not just their courage, but their compassion. To survive, they'd had to burn human beings alive and then keep moving. Psychologists who studied veterans in the years after the war noticed a pattern among flamethrower operators and tank crews. They suffered more nightmares, drank more heavily, and were more likely to isolate themselves from family. Some refused to talk about the war at all. Others talked too much, try to exorcise the memories through repetition. "It's not the killing that haunts me," one operator admitted. "It's the smell. It comes back every time I see smoke." The civilians of Okinawa bore their own invisible wounds. Entire families have been wiped out, villages reduced to soot. Survivors emerge from the caves thin as ghosts, their skin gray from months underground. American medics tried to help, handing out rations and water, but many locals wouldn't come near them at first. The propaganda had been too strong. To them, these soldiers with flamethrowers were still demons. But slowly, the truth emerged. The Americans brought food, not knives. Doctors treated the wounded. Chaplains buried the dead. The Marines began calling Okinawan children buddy and teaching them English words. Amid the ruins, small acts of humanity flickered like sparks in the darkness. For the Japanese army, Okinawa was the final lesson, a vision of what awaited the homeland. Military observers on the mainland studied reports from the battle and realized the horror. If the Americans invaded Japan itself, the islands would burn just as Okinawa had. Every city, every family, every temple. When they read accounts of the flamethrowers and napalm, even the most loyal officers felt chill. "We cannot stop the fire," one general admitted privately. "We have built a culture of sacrifice, and now the fire will consume it." After Japan's surrender, the burned hills of Okinawa became silent memorials. Thousands of bodies, Japanese and American alike, remained buried in collapsed tunnels and caves. Locals began calling the land Chi no Shima, the island of blood. Farmers refused to plow certain areas, believing the spirits of the dead still lingered beneath the soil. When rains came, they said the earth bled black. In 1955, a decade after the war, construction crews digging near Mabuni Ridge uncovered one of the largest mass graves on the island. Hundreds of Japanese soldiers fused together by heat, their bones and weapons welded into a single mass. It was as if the fire had frozen them in time. For years, the U.S. military maintained bases across Okinawa, their airstrips built atop old battlefields. Locals protested, saying the land still belonged to the dead. American commanders quietly agreed to leave some sites untouched, unmarked cemeteries of war. Today, visitors to Okinawa can still walk through preserved cave systems like the former Shuri tunnels. The air inside is cool and damp. The walls are blackened by soot that no rain has ever washed away. Some tourists bring incense. Others just stand in silence. Guides warn against touching the walls. They still remember, they say. In the museums, photographs of the battle line the walls. Marines with flamethrowers, tanks firing streams of fire, civilians emerging from the smoke. Beneath them, a plaque reads, "Here, the world learned that fire could burn not only bodies, but souls." For both Japan and America, Okinawa became a scar they would carry forever, a place where victory looked too much like vengeance, and where the earth itself bore witness. But in that blackened soil, new grass grows. Children now play on fields where tanks once roared. The island still smells of salt and rain, and on certain days when the wind shifts, maybe a hint of smoke. The war ended. The fire didn't. When the last battles of Okinawa faded into memory, the world began to reckon with what fire had done. The flamethrowers and napalm of Iwo Jima and Okinawa were not just weapons. They were prototypes of modern annihilation, a preview of the total war that would engulf Japan in the months to come. Their legacy was complicated: tactical brilliance, moral ambiguity, and psychological trauma woven together in a tapestry of flame. The U.S. military, reflecting on the Pacific Campaign, recognized that flamethrowers had saved countless lives. Assaulting entrenched caves with rifles and grenades had cost hundreds of Marines per day. Flame tanks and M2 operators could clear a hill in hours rather than weeks. Strategists called it efficiency. Yet efficiency had a price. Every cave burned alive left lasting questions about ethics, about humanity, about the cost of victory. Napalm, in particular, became infamous. After Okinawa, American planners noted its devastating psychological effect. Soldiers and civilians alike feared it more than bullets, more than shells. When the Allies prepared for Operation Downfall, the planned invasion of the Japanese mainland, napalm would have been used on a scale unprecedented in history. Some military analysts suggested it could have ended the war faster than conventional assaults. But its use would have left entire cities reduced to burning ruins, repeating the horror of Okinawa on the home islands. Japan itself bore the echoes of flame. Survivors of Okinawa, both military and civilian, carried memories of terror, loss, and burned landscapes. Stories of the Shuri Line, of mothers throwing their children into cliffs, of soldiers choosing seppuku over capture, permeated post-war literature and film. The images haunted a generation, shaping the national psyche. Fire had been a weapon of war, but also a teacher. It revealed both the depths of human cruelty and the resilience of those who survived. American society, too, absorbed the lessons of flame. Wartime journalists and photographers had documented the fire with stark realism. Their reports and images reached newspapers, magazines, and eventually school textbooks. Citizens glimpsed war's raw brutality in ways they had never before imagined. The tales of Okinawa and Iwo Jima shaped public perception. Victory was necessary, but it came at a staggering human cost. The phrase, "hell of fire," entered the national consciousness, a warning for future generations. Veterans returned home carrying invisible scars. Flamethrower operators, in particular, struggled to reconcile the life-saving rationale of their work with the horrific visual and emotional imprint of their actions. Psychologists later identified a pattern of post-traumatic stress among them, compounded by the knowledge that every cave they burned had once held human beings with lives, families, and dreams. For many, the fire never left. They carried it in dreams, in nightmares, in a lingering smell of smoke in the corners of their homes. The flame also influenced the post-war military. The lessons learned in Iwo Jima and Okinawa informed doctrines for close-quarters combat, bunker clearing, and psychological warfare. Engineers developed safer, more efficient flamethrowers, while strategists debated the moral implications of incendiary weapons. Napalm would see extensive use in Korea and Vietnam, proving that the weapon of terror born in the Pacific had become an enduring component of modern warfare. Yet perhaps the most enduring legacy was ethical. Okinawa forced militaries and societies to ask difficult questions. How much destruction is justified to save lives? What are the limits of technological supremacy? When does survival cross the line into atrocity? The answer was never simple. The flames of Okinawa burned clarity into gray territory, where heroism and horror, duty and guilt, courage and cruelty all coexisted. Today, Okinawa's hills are green again. Tourists walk along paths where flame tanks once roared. Museums preserve photographs of M2 operators, tanks, and civilians. Survivors and their descendants tell stories that echo across decades. The island has healed physically, but the lessons of fire endure. The flamethrower, napalm, and the scorched earth of Okinawa left a mark far beyond the battlefield. They reshaped warfare, redefined heroism, and revealed the terrifying power of fire as both weapon and symbol. From the hills of Shuri to the streets of Tokyo, The fire whispered a warning that would never be forgotten. Victory may come from fire, but the soul of war is never untouched. The echoes of flame continue to teach us, reminding the world that the power to destroy is inseparable from the responsibility to remember.